Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The November morning in 1871 arrived cold and unforgiving across the ridges of western North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge Mountains created natural barriers between communities that had learned to survive through isolation and self-reliance. In a weathered cabin perched on a slope overlooking a narrow valley, the Thornton family prepared for something extraordinary, something that would mark them as different from the dozens of other struggling families scattered across these ancient peaks. They were having their photograph taken, an expense so extravagant it required selling 3 months' worth of preserved vegetables and 2 quilts that had taken Rebecca Thornton an entire winter to complete. The photographer, a thin man named Silas Weatherby who traveled the mountain circuits with his equipment loaded on a sturdy mule, had arrived the previous afternoon and spent the night in their modest barn. He was one of those rare visitors who brought news from distant towns, stories of railroads pushing westward, of cities growing larger than anyone in these mountains could properly imagine, and of opportunities that seemed as distant as the stars themselves. Rebecca had insisted on the photograph despite her husband's reservations about the cost, believing that capturing their family in this moment would serve as a testament to their faith, their unity, and their determination to build something lasting in this harsh landscape. The cabin stood among a cluster of similar structures, but the Thorntons had managed to add a small covered porch and had whitewashed the exterior logs, giving their home a cleaner appearance than most. Inside, the single large room was divided by hanging quilts into sleeping areas, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough-hewn table occupying the center. The smell of wood smoke, cured meat, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging from the rafters created an atmosphere that spoke of hard work and careful management of scarce resources. William Thornton, the family patriarch, was a man of 43 years who carried himself with the rigid posture of someone determined to project strength even when circumstances suggested vulnerability. His face bore the deep lines carved by years of outdoor labor, and his hands showed the permanent stains and calluses of a man who worked with soil, timber, and stone. He had fought briefly in the war that ended 6 years prior, returning home with a limp he rarely acknowledged and a silence about those experiences that his wife had learned not to probe. He believed in providence, in hard work, and in the fundamental idea that a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide for those dependent upon him. Rebecca, his wife of 20 years, possessed a quiet strength that manifested differently than her husband's stern determination. At 38, she maintained a dignified bearing despite the premature aging that mountain life imposed on women. Her hands were never idle, always mending, cooking, preserving, or teaching her children the countless skills necessary for survival in their isolated world. She read from the Bible each evening by firelight, the only book the family owned, and she sang hymns while working, her voice carrying across the valley on still mornings. Her faith was not merely a Sunday observation but a framework through which she interpreted every hardship, every small blessing, and every decision that shaped their lives. The children represented both the family's greatest joy and their most pressing concern about the future. 14-year-old Samuel was developing into a younger version of his father, with broad shoulders beginning to show the muscle that came from splitting wood, clearing land, and helping with the heavy labor that defined mountain farming. He had inherited his father's serious nature and rarely smiled, already carrying himself with the burden of responsibilities he would one day assume. His mother saw intelligence in his eyes, a quick mind that absorbed the limited education she could provide, and she harbored quiet hopes that he might someday escape the confines of their isolated existence. Martha, at 12 years old, had become her mother's primary assistant, managing household tasks with a competence beyond her years. She could cook, preserve food, sew, and manage the vegetable garden with minimal supervision. Her face still held the softness of childhood, but her eyes reflected an awareness of the harsh realities that shaped their world. She understood, perhaps better than her parents realized, that her future would likely mirror her mother's path, bound to some mountain man's cabin where she would spend her days in the same endless cycle of work and child-rearing. 10-year-old Joseph brought a measure of lightness to the family's stern existence. He possessed a curiosity that sometimes worried his father, asking questions about the world beyond their mountains, wondering aloud about places he had heard mentioned but could never properly imagine. He was quick with numbers, able to calculate yields and measurements faster than his older brother, and he showed a talent for drawing, scratching images in the dirt or on precious scraps of paper with charcoal when he could find them. His mother encouraged this creativity while his father worried it indicated impractical tendencies. The youngest, 7-year-old Ruth, remained partly sheltered from the family's struggles by her age and her position as the baby of the household. She followed Martha everywhere, learning through imitation, and she still possessed the capacity for spontaneous joy that harsh experience had not yet diminished. Her laughter, rare as it was becoming, could still briefly transform the cabin's atmosphere, reminding them all of what innocence looked like before the mountains wore it away as they prepared for the photograph. Rebecca insisted everyone wear their Sunday clothing, garments carefully preserved for church services and special occasions. For William, this meant a rough wool suit that had belonged to his father, altered to fit his frame. Rebecca wore a dark dress with a white collar she had painstakingly embroidered during the previous winter. The children were dressed in simple but clean clothing, their hair combed and faces scrubbed until they shone. The family stood outside their cabin as Silas positioned them carefully, adjusting angles and considering the morning light. William held the family Bible prominently in his hands, a deliberate choice meant to signal their values and faith to anyone who might later view this image. Rebecca stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm, the other at her side. The children were arranged in descending height, Samuel standing tall beside his father, Ruth seated on a rough bench in front. Their expressions, held for the long exposure time required by the photographic process, showed the serious dignity they had been instructed to maintain. No smiles, no movement, just the solemn presentation of a family united in faith and purpose. What the photograph could not capture, what no frozen image could possibly reveal, were the growing tensions that already existed beneath this carefully constructed facade. William's rigid determination masked a deepening desperation about their financial circumstances. The land they worked was not their own but leased from a distant landowner who had recently increased the terms, demanding a larger share of their already meager yields. 3 consecutive years of difficult growing seasons, combined with the general economic instability that plagued the region after the war, had created a situation where they were falling further behind despite working harder than ever. Rebecca's faith, so prominently displayed in their photograph, was being tested by realities she struggled to reconcile with her beliefs about providence and divine care. She watched her children go to bed hungry more frequently, saw their clothing becoming increasingly patched and threadbare, and understood that the life she had imagined providing for them was slipping away despite her best efforts. She prayed constantly, seeking guidance and strength, but the heavens seemed increasingly silent while their problems grew more pressing. The children, despite their youth, sensed the strain in ways they could not fully articulate. Samuel had overheard conversations between his parents late at night, whispered arguments about debts and obligations. Martha had noticed her mother crying while working alone, tears quickly wiped away before anyone could comment. Joseph had seen his father standing alone on the ridge above their cabin, staring out at the mountains with an expression that mixed determination with something approaching defeat. Even young Ruth understood that requests for food were sometimes met with distraction rather than satisfaction. After the photograph session concluded, Silas packed his equipment carefully and accepted payment in the form of goods rather than scarce currency. He promised to return with the finished photograph within 2 months, traveling his circuit through other mountain communities before completing his development work and making the return journey. William watched the photographer depart, calculating that by the time the image returned, they would either have found a way to stabilize their situation or would be facing even more difficult decisions about their future. The photograph itself would become a lie, though none of them understood this yet as they posed that November morning. It would show a family of faith, of unity, of solid respectability anchored by biblical values and parental devotion. It would suggest permanence, continuity, the kind of generational stability that people in 1871 aspired to create. Visitors seeing such an image would nod approvingly, recognizing the visible markers of proper family structure and moral foundation. They would see William's stern countenance as paternal authority, Rebecca's calm expression as maternal strength, and the children's serious faces as evidence of good upbringing and discipline. But already, in that moment of photographic preservation, seeds of betrayal were germinating in William's mind, though even he did not yet fully recognize them as such. He had recently met with a land agent named Cornelius Blackwood, a conversation he had not mentioned to Rebecca. Blackwood represented interests from the eastern part of the state, investors seeking to consolidate mountain properties for timber exploitation and future railroad expansion. The agent had made observations about William's situation with an accuracy that was both impressive and disturbing, noting the obvious signs of struggle while also commenting on the evident quality of his children. William had dismissed the conversation initially, offended by implications he refused to acknowledge. But Blackwood's words had planted themselves in his mind, growing like persistent weeds through the following weeks. The agent had spoken of opportunities, of practical solutions to immediate problems, of the hard choices men sometimes had to make to secure their family's future. He had mentioned almost casually that there were arrangements possible, contracts that could be structured to everyone's benefit, ways that William could obtain clear title to land while ensuring his children would receive training and opportunities they could never access in these isolated mountains. Rebecca knew nothing of this conversation, and William had convinced himself that this silence was not deception but merely the exercise of his authority as family head to explore options before presenting them for consideration. He told himself he was being prudent, investigating possibilities, maintaining his responsibility to find solutions regardless of how unconventional they might initially appear. The weight of this secret knowledge added to the tension visible in his jaw during the photograph session, though Silas attributed this to the natural discomfort of posing for an extended exposure. The community in which the Thorntons lived was dispersed across the mountain ridges, with individual cabins separated by miles of difficult terrain. Church services brought families together each Sunday at a simple log structure that served multiple denominations through the month, with circuit preachers rotating through when they could manage the journey. These gatherings provided crucial social interaction, opportunities to share news and resources, and the occasional marriage or baptism that marked the continuation of mountain life despite its hardships. Reverend Ezekiel Marsh, who preached to their congregation once monthly, was a man of 60 years who had spent 4 decades traveling these mountains. He knew the Thorntons as regular attendees, people who contributed what they could to church maintenance and who demonstrated the kind of public piety that communities valued. He had baptized all 4 children, had counseled William and Rebecca during difficult periods, and considered them exemplars of proper Christian family life. The Reverend would be shocked, months later, when the truth emerged about what transpired in the shadows of their apparent devotion. As November progressed toward the harder cold of December, the Thorntons settled back into their routine of survival. Samuel worked alongside his father, clearing new ground for spring planting, repairing tools and structures, hunting when opportunities arose. Martha and Rebecca managed the endless domestic labor that kept the household functioning, preserving what little food they could set aside, mending clothing until the fabric could bear no more repairs. Joseph attended to lighter chores while continuing his makeshift education, reading passages from the Bible and learning basic mathematics through practical application. Ruth helped where she could, her childhood still partly preserved by her position as youngest. But William's secret weighed on him, growing heavier as he contemplated options he had once considered unthinkable. He began asking subtle questions of other men during church gatherings, inquiring about indenture practices, about how families in previous generations had sometimes placed children in situations that provided training and future opportunities. He learned that such arrangements, while less common than in earlier decades, still occurred throughout Appalachia, with children entering service contracts that could span years in exchange for education, skill development, or financial considerations that benefited struggling families. The rationalization developed gradually in William's mind, building on itself through December's cold nights. He convinced himself that his children faced limited futures in these mountains, that Samuel would likely repeat his own struggles, that Martha would marry into similar poverty, that Joseph's curiosity and Ruth's innocence would be slowly crushed by the relentless demands of mountain subsistence. He told himself that arrangements with established households in more prosperous regions could provide advantages they could never access otherwise, that temporary separation might ultimately serve everyone's interests, that difficult short-term decisions sometimes enabled better long-term outcomes. Rebecca sensed her husband's distraction but attributed it to their ongoing financial stress. She increased her prayers, seeking divine intervention while also working harder to stretch their limited resources. She taught Martha more advanced skills, prepared Samuel for future responsibilities, encouraged Joseph's education, and tried to maintain Ruth's childhood joy as long as possible. She believed, with the faith that had always sustained her, that Providence would provide a way through their difficulties if they remained faithful and diligent. Christmas approached with its mixture of spiritual significance and practical hardship. The family observed the holiday simply, with Rebecca reading the nativity story and leading hymns, with small gifts made from available materials, with a meal that strained their provisions but marked the occasion as special. William participated in these observances while his mind churned with calculations and rationalizations, with Blackwood's words echoing through his thoughts, with the growing conviction that he was approaching a decision that would change everything. The photograph would return in late January, a frozen moment showing a family that no longer existed in the form it depicted, though the full reality would take additional weeks to unfold completely. January 1872 brought brutal cold to the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of deep freeze that made every outdoor task an ordeal and turned cabins into fragile fortresses against nature's assault. Ice formed on the inside of the Thorntons' windows, creating crystalline patterns that Ruth found beautiful but that represented dangerous heat loss they could barely afford. The wood supply, carefully calculated to last through winter, was depleting faster than expected, forcing Samuel and William to venture out in dangerous conditions to fell additional trees and haul them back through snow that sometimes reached above the boys' knees. The family's food situation had deteriorated beyond Rebecca's ability to disguise it through creative preparation. Meals consisted increasingly of cornmeal mush, occasional beans from their dwindling stores, and rare bits of salt pork stretched to flavor multiple servings. The children's faces showed the beginning signs of inadequate nutrition, a thinness that went beyond natural leanness into something more concerning. Rebecca herself ate less than she served others, a sacrifice William noticed but did not comment upon, his guilt adding to the weight he already carried. That on a gray afternoon in mid-January, Silas Weatherby returned with the completed photograph mounted on thick board and wrapped carefully in oilcloth for protection. William paid the remaining balance in the form of 2 cured rabbit skins and a small bag of cornmeal, watching the family's provisions shrink even as they received this luxury item. Rebecca unwrapped the photograph with hands roughened by cold and work, her face lighting briefly at seeing their family captured in such formal dignity. She propped it on the mantel above the fireplace, the one spot in their cabin that served as a display area for their few treasured possessions. The children gathered to examine this strange representation of themselves, fascinated by the way the camera had frozen them in time. Joseph studied the image intently, noting how their expressions appeared more severe than he remembered feeling during the session, how the formal poses created an impression of rigid formality that did not quite match his internal experience of their family life. Martha saw her mother's pride and felt a corresponding warmth, even as part of her mind noted the contrast between the photograph's suggestion of stability and their actual precarious circumstances. William stared at the image longer than the others, seeing something different in those frozen faces. He saw responsibilities embodied in Samuel's developing frame, saw potential in Martha's capable expression, saw intelligence in Joseph's eyes, saw innocence in Ruth's young features. And with each observation, Blackwood's words gained new weight, the agent's suggestions transforming from disturbing propositions into potentially practical solutions. He had been avoiding another meeting with the land agent, but the photograph somehow crystallized his thinking, making the abstract possibility of action feel suddenly concrete and urgent. 3 days after the photograph's arrival, William told Rebecca he needed to make a trip to the settlement at Cedar Springs, a journey of nearly 2 days each direction. He claimed he needed to discuss the lease terms with their landlord's representative and explore possibilities for extending credit at the general store. Rebecca accepted this explanation without question, accustomed to her husband making such practical journeys when weather permitted. She packed him provisions from their meager stores and watched him depart on the old horse they somehow still managed to keep fed, though the animal's ribs showed more prominently than she liked. William's actual destination was not Cedar Springs but a larger town called Asheville, where Cornelius Blackwood maintained an office above a bank building. The journey took William through increasingly developed territory, past other struggling mountain families, through small settlements where evidence of poverty competed with occasional signs of modest prosperity, and finally into a town that seemed impossibly large and bustling to someone who spent most of his time in near isolation. The contrast between this active commercial center and his own cabin's desperate simplicity reinforced his growing conviction that his children deserved opportunities beyond what the mountains offered. Blackwood received him in an office warmed by a coal stove, the heat almost uncomfortable after days of inadequate warmth. The land agent was a man of perhaps 50 years, well-dressed in city fashion, with soft hands that had never known manual labor. He projected competence and authority, speaking in the assured tones of someone accustomed to managing complex transactions involving people's most fundamental resources and relationships. He offered William coffee, a luxury the mountain farmer had not tasted in over a year, and settled into conversation with an ease that suggested he had conducted similar discussions many times before. The agent began by acknowledging William's difficult position with a frankness that was both refreshing and disturbing. He laid out the economic realities facing mountain families with precision, noting how changing patterns of land ownership, resource extraction, and commercial development were making traditional subsistence farming increasingly untenable. He spoke of forces beyond individual control, of economic transformations that would eventually force mountain families to either adapt or be displaced. His analysis was accurate enough to be depressing, painting a picture of inevitable decline unless dramatic changes occurred. Then Blackwood pivoted to what he called opportunities, explaining in detail the various arrangements he facilitated between struggling mountain families and more established households in the eastern part of the state. These arrangements involved placing children into service contracts, formal agreements where children would work for specified households while receiving training in various trades or domestic skills. The contracts typically ran for 7 to 10 years, during which the children would receive room, board, basic education, and practical training that would prepare them for eventual independence with actual marketable skills. The financial aspects of these arrangements varied based on circumstances, Blackwood explained. Some contracts involved direct payments to the family, essentially purchasing the children's labor for the contracted period. Others involved land transfers, with property deeds changing hands in exchange for the family's agreement to the service contracts. Still others combined elements, creating complex agreements that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. The agent emphasized that everything was legal, properly documented, and designed to benefit everyone involved in the transaction. William listened with a combination of fascination and horror, his mind simultaneously recoiling from the implications while also calculating the possibilities. Blackwood seemed to sense this internal conflict and modulated his presentation accordingly, emphasizing the benefits to the children rather than the financial relief to the parents. He described households with libraries, with music instruction, with connections to apprenticeships in profitable trades. He painted pictures of futures where Samuel might learn carpentry or blacksmithing, where Martha could be trained in fine household management, where Joseph's intelligence could be developed through actual schooling, where Ruth could be raised with advantages that would elevate her future marriage prospects. The land aspect entered the conversation almost as an afterthought, though William understood this was calculated positioning rather than casual mention. Blackwood represented interests seeking to assemble larger tracts of mountain land for timber operations and potential railroad development. The agent explained that William's leased property, along with adjacent parcels Blackwood was also working to acquire, formed part of a strategic holding that investors were assembling. If William agreed to contracts for his children, Blackwood could arrange for him to receive clear title to a modest but adequate parcel of land, enough for him and Rebecca to work without the constant pressure of lease payments and landlord demands. The equation was presented clearly. William's children would enter multi-year service contracts with carefully selected households in the eastern counties. William and Rebecca would receive outright ownership of land sufficient for their own needs, along with enough immediate cash payment to settle their current debts and provide a modest operating reserve. The children would gain training and opportunities otherwise completely unavailable to them. The investors Blackwood represented would acquire the strategic parcels they sought for future development. Everyone's needs would be addressed through a single comprehensive agreement, William asked about the children's welfare, about guarantees and protections, about what would happen if the arrangements proved unsatisfactory. Blackwood had answers prepared for all these concerns, producing sample contracts that specified conditions, obligations, and remedies for various contingencies. He emphasized that these were legal instruments, enforceable through courts, providing protections for all parties. He noted that many families in the mountains had made similar arrangements over the years, that this was an established practice rather than some experimental or questionable scheme. The agent also addressed what he delicately termed the moral and spiritual dimensions of such decisions. He noted that good Christian parents sometimes had to make difficult choices for their children's ultimate benefit, that short-term separation could serve long-term interests, that biblical precedents existed for children entering service arrangements that developed their capabilities and characters. He quoted scripture about being good stewards of the gifts God provided, about parents' responsibility to launch their children successfully into adult life, about the difference between comfortable choices and truly beneficial ones. William spent hours in that overheated office, examining documents, asking questions, wrestling with implications he both wanted to avoid and felt compelled to consider. Blackwood showed remarkable patience, allowing the mountain farmer to work through his resistance at his own pace. The agent understood that such decisions required time, that William needed to convince himself rather than simply be convinced by external arguments. He had seen this process before, knew the signs when a desperate parent was approaching acceptance of what had initially seemed unthinkable. As the January afternoon faded into evening, William found himself negotiating details rather than rejecting the entire concept. He specified that the households must be respectable, that the children must receive actual education, not just work training, that the contracts must allow for periodic communication and eventual reunion. Blackwood agreed to all these stipulations, assuring William that the families he worked with met high standards and that the contracts would reflect every protection William wanted included. He produced a preliminary agreement outlining the basic framework, suggesting William take it home to review before making any final decision. William left Asheville in darkness, riding through cold night air with documents hidden in his coat. His mind churned with conflicting thoughts, rationalizations competing with guilt, practical calculations wrestling with moral unease. He told himself he was exploring options, that reviewing documents did not commit him to anything, that a prudent man investigated all possibilities before reaching decisions. But beneath these conscious justifications, he understood he had already crossed a threshold, that his willingness to even consider such arrangements represented a fundamental shift in how he understood his role as father and his obligations to his children. The return journey took 2 days, with William stopping at a crude wayside shelter where other travelers sought protection from the cold. He shared the space with a timber worker, a traveling preacher, and a family moving westward in search of cheaper land. The conversations revealed the common struggles facing people throughout the region, the constant pressure of economic forces beyond individual control, the difficult choices families faced when traditional paths no longer led to stability or improvement. William listened more than he spoke, absorbing these stories as further justification for the path he was increasingly certain he would take. When he arrived home, Rebecca greeted him with relief and questions about his journey. He told partial truths about meeting with representatives regarding their lease, about discussions concerning their debt situation, about possible arrangements that might improve their circumstances. He said nothing about Blackwood, about service contracts, about the documents hidden in his coat. He told himself this silence was temporary, that he would discuss everything with Rebecca once he had fully considered all implications, that withholding information was different from actual deception. The children noticed their father's distraction, his tendency to stare at the photograph on the mantel with an expression they could not interpret. Samuel sensed something significant had changed but lacked the framework to understand what it might be. Martha observed her mother's growing concern about her husband's demeanor but said nothing, already trained in the female art of noticing without openly acknowledging. Joseph felt vague unease but attributed it to the general hardship of their winter circumstances. Ruth remained largely oblivious, still young enough to be partly sheltered from adult tensions. William spent his evenings reading the contract documents by firelight after everyone else had gone to bed, studying the legal language that would govern his children's futures if he signed. The terminology was formal and precise, specifying obligations, conditions, and terms with a clarity that made the arrangement seem almost normal, just another form of business transaction properly documented and executed. The financial components were specific, detailing exactly what William would receive in exchange for his agreement. The land description identified a particular parcel with clear boundaries and good access, enough to support 2 people comfortably without the pressure of lease payments. February arrived with slightly moderating temperatures but continuing hardship. The family's food situation reached crisis levels, with Rebecca unable to disguise the inadequacy of their provisions. The children went to bed hungry more nights than not, their complaints growing weaker as they adapted to sustained deprivation. William watched this deterioration with increasing desperation, his guilt about considering the contracts now mixed with guilt about his apparent inability to solve their problems through more conventional means. The photograph continued to stare down from the mantel, a reminder of the family unit he was contemplating permanently altering for what he told himself were ultimately sound reasons. The decision crystallized not through careful deliberation but through crisis. Martha collapsed while working in the cabin, fainting from a combination of inadequate nutrition and the physical demands Rebecca placed on both of them. Rebecca caught her daughter before she struck the floor, then held her while Martha regained consciousness, both of them crying quietly. William witnessed this scene and something broke inside him, his resistance to Blackwood's proposition finally crumbling under the accumulated weight of circumstances he could no longer pretend to manage through faith and determination alone. That evening, William told Rebecca they needed to discuss their situation seriously. He laid out their reality with brutal honesty, detailing their debts, their depleted resources, their landlord's pending demands, and the mathematical impossibility of their current path leading anywhere except complete destitution. Rebecca listened with tears streaming down her face, already understanding that this conversation was leading somewhere she did not want to follow. When William began explaining about Blackwood, about the service contracts, about the land opportunity, she initially refused to even consider it, declaring that their children were not property to be traded for financial advantage. But William persisted, hour after hour through that long February night, working through Rebecca's resistance with the same patient determination Blackwood had shown with him. He emphasized the opportunities the children would receive, the education and training otherwise completely unavailable, the escape from the poverty that was slowly destroying them all. He noted that the contracts were temporary, that reunion would eventually occur, that short-term separation might enable long-term relationships that would otherwise be poisoned by continuing deprivation and mutual resentment. He reminded her of biblical precedents, of Joseph sold into Egypt who ultimately saved his family, of Samuel dedicated to temple service, of children who left home to fulfill larger purposes that Rebecca's resistance gradually eroded, not through conviction but through exhaustion and despair. She understood their situation as clearly as William did, recognized that their current path led nowhere good, and could not identify alternatives that seemed remotely viable. She extracted promises from William about the quality of households, about maintaining contact, about eventual reunion, about the children receiving genuine benefits rather than simply being exploited for their labor. William assured her on every point, showing her the contract language, pointing to protections and provisions, painting the most optimistic possible picture of how these arrangements would unfold. By dawn, Rebecca had given her devastated consent, crying quietly while acknowledging that she could not identify better options given their desperate circumstances. They agreed to keep the plans secret from the children until final arrangements were made, telling themselves this protected the children from unnecessary anxiety rather than recognizing it as the adult cowardice it actually represented. They prayed together seeking divine blessing for their decision, both needing to believe that God would somehow transform their betrayal into ultimate benefit for those they were preparing to sacrifice for their own survival. February's final week brought deceptive warmth to the mountains, a false spring that melted snow and created muddy paths that would refreeze when temperatures inevitably dropped again. William made another journey to Asheville, this time openly discussing his purpose with Rebecca, though they told the children only that their father was finalizing arrangements regarding their land situation. He carried the signed preliminary agreements, ready to conclude the transaction that would fundamentally alter their family structure while ostensibly securing their material future. Blackwood received him with professional satisfaction, pleased to conclude an arrangement he had been developing for months. The agent had already identified specific households for each child, families whose circumstances and needs aligned with the children's ages and capabilities. He presented detailed information about each placement, emphasizing positive aspects while minimizing elements that might cause William to reconsider. Samuel would go to a farming family in the Piedmont region, people who needed strong labor but who also operated a small mill that could provide useful mechanical training. Martha would enter a merchant household in a growing town, where domestic service would expose her to commerce and refined household management. Joseph would be placed with a schoolteacher and his wife, people who could develop his evident intellectual potential. Young Ruth would join a childless couple seeking to raise a daughter with the advantages they could provide. The financial transactions occurred with bureaucratic efficiency. William received a deed to 40 acres of mountain land with clear title, property that included a small existing cabin and access to water. He accepted payment in gold coin, more money than he had held at one time in his entire life, enough to settle all debts with surplus remaining. He signed contract after contract, legal documents that transferred his children's labor and custody to others for periods ranging from 7 years for Ruth to 9 years for Samuel. The ink was barely dry when William began feeling the full weight of what he had done, but the mechanisms were now in motion and retreat would require admitting he had sold his children for property and coin, an acknowledgement he could not bear to voice even internally. Blackwood explained the logistics with practiced precision. The children would be collected within the week, transported to their respective placements in groups under the supervision of agents who regularly conducted such movements. William would have opportunity to prepare them, though the agents suggested keeping explanations simple and positive, emphasizing opportunity rather than separation, adventure rather than abandonment. Blackwood provided written summaries of each placement for William to review with Rebecca, information they could share with the children to make the transition seem less traumatic. William returned home with documents hidden in his coat and gold weighing heavy in a leather pouch, the tangible results of a transaction he could barely acknowledge even to himself. He found Rebecca maintaining their household routines with mechanical precision, her face showing the strain of knowledge she could not escape. They spent an evening reviewing the placement information together, reading descriptions of households and people they would have to trust with their children's welfare for years to come. Rebecca insisted on believing these were good people, that the arrangements would truly benefit their children, because the alternative was accepting they had betrayed those they loved most for material gain. The following morning, they called the children together and explained that changes were coming, opportunities that would take them away temporarily but that would provide advantages impossible to obtain in the mountains. They spoke in vague terms about education and training, about kind families eager to help young people develop useful skills, about temporary separations that would ultimately enable better futures for everyone. The children's reactions ranged from Samuel's stoic acceptance, to Martha's quiet tears, to Joseph's confused questions, to Ruth's frightened incomprehension. Samuel, at 14, possessed enough understanding to recognize that something significant was being hidden beneath his parents' optimistic presentation. He asked direct questions about duration, about conditions, about why this was necessary, questions his father deflected with generalities about opportunity and advancement. The boy's expression showed both suspicion and dawning realization, though he lacked the framework to fully articulate what he sensed about the true nature of these arrangements. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, at that frozen image of their family united in apparent faith and stability, and understood that something fundamental had broken even if he could not identify exactly what or how. Martha responded with the resignation already developing in her character, accepting that adult decisions would shape her future regardless of her preferences or feelings. She asked about the merchant household, about what her duties would involve, about whether she could write to her mother. Rebecca assured her they would maintain correspondence, though both understood that illiteracy would make this promise difficult to fulfill. Martha held Ruth close, already feeling protective responsibility for a sister she would be unable to shelter from whatever lay ahead for the youngest child. Joseph's questions reflected his characteristic curiosity combined with genuine confusion about why opportunities supposedly beneficial required family separation. He asked why they could not all go together to wherever these advantages existed, why training and education required years apart rather than months, why families who wanted to help children would take them far from their parents. William's answers grew shorter and more irritable as Joseph's persistent questioning exposed the logical inconsistencies in their justifications, until finally the boy fell silent, recognizing his father's anger as a warning against further probing. Ruth simply cried, too young to understand complex explanations but old enough to sense that something terrible was happening. She clung to her mother, seeking reassurance that Rebecca could not honestly provide. The sight of her youngest daughter's terror while knowing she would soon be surrendered to strangers represented a form of agony Rebecca had not imagined possible when she agreed to William's plan. She held Ruth while maintaining the pretense that everything would ultimately be fine, a lie that poisoned the comfort she tried to offer. The remaining days passed with nightmarish speed, routine activities now laden with awareness that familiar patterns were ending. Rebecca cooked meals with extra care, as though improved preparation could somehow compensate for the betrayal accompanying each serving. William worked alongside Samuel with unusual gentleness, trying to impart final guidance while avoiding acknowledgement of the coming rupture. Martha taught Ruth small tasks with desperate intensity, attempting to compress years of sisterly instruction into hours. Joseph drew pictures of their cabin and the surrounding mountains, creating visual memories of a home he would not see again for nearly a decade. The collection day arrived with gray skies and cold rain, weather that matched the family's emotional state. 2 wagons appeared mid-morning, driven by men who conducted such transports regularly and who showed professional efficiency unmarred by emotional engagement. They verified identities against their paperwork, checked the children's minimal belongings, and explained the travel schedule with the indifference of people performing routine tasks. William and Rebecca were expected to say their goodbyes quickly, to avoid emotional scenes that might upset the children or delay departure. Samuel maintained composure through sheer determination, shaking his father's hand like a man rather than accepting an embrace like a child. He looked William directly in the eyes with an expression that mixed respect with something approaching contempt, an acknowledgement that he understood more than had been explicitly stated. He promised to work hard, to honor his family, to make the best of whatever situation awaited him. Then he climbed into the wagon without looking back, already beginning the emotional separation that would be necessary for survival in his new circumstances. Martha collapsed into her mother's arms, both of them crying openly despite intentions to remain strong. Rebecca whispered desperate assurances, promises about reunion and better futures, words meant to comfort but that rang hollow even as she spoke them. Martha held Ruth one final time, telling her little sister to be good, to remember her family, to believe they would all be together again someday. Then the agents separated them, placing Martha in one wagon and Ruth in another, dividing the siblings according to their different destinations. Joseph allowed his mother to hold him while maintaining the rigid control that prevented full emotional collapse. He asked one final question, whether they would remember him, a query that pierced Rebecca's heart with its implicit doubt about parental devotion. She assured him fervently that they would think of him every day, that he was loved beyond measure, that nothing about these arrangements changed their fundamental connection as family. Joseph nodded without speaking, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to argue. He climbed into the wagon beside Samuel, the brothers sitting together in silence while rain began falling harder. Ruth screamed as agents lifted her into the wagon, her small hands reaching desperately toward her mother. Rebecca moved to retrieve her, but William held her back, preventing the maternal instinct that would have disrupted the entire transaction. Ruth's cries continued as the wagon began moving, her voice calling for her mother with such anguish that even the agents seemed momentarily disturbed. Rebecca watched until the wagons disappeared around a bend, her youngest child's cries fading into the sound of rain and distance, the terrible price of the land deed and gold now fully apparent. The cabin seemed impossibly empty after the children's departure, their absence creating voids that physical presence had previously filled without conscious recognition. The corners where they slept, the spaces where they worked and played, the routines structured around their needs and schedules, all suddenly highlighted through their removal. Rebecca moved through the rooms in a daze, touching objects the children had used, unable to begin the practical work that normally filled her days. William avoided the cabin entirely, walking the boundaries of their newly owned land with the deed in his pocket, trying to convince himself that secure property justified the cost even as guilt gnawed at his consciousness. The photograph remained on the mantel, now transformed into a mockery of what it had supposedly represented. That frozen image of family unity, of parental devotion, of children safely sheltered within their father's authority and their mother's love, now stood as evidence of betrayal rather than virtue. The Bible William held so prominently in the image sat unopened on the table, its moral authority compromised by misuse in service of rationalizations rather than genuine guidance. The serious expressions that had seemed to indicate proper dignity now appeared as premonitions of suffering, the children's solemn faces unknowingly anticipating the future their parents were even then beginning to arrange. News of the children's departure spread quickly through their dispersed mountain community, traveling along the informal networks that connected isolated families. Initial reactions were carefully neutral, with neighbors acknowledging that families sometimes made difficult decisions during hard times and that indenture arrangements had historical precedent. But as details emerged, as people learned that all 4 children had been sent away simultaneously in exchange for land and money, the community's response shifted toward disapproval disguised as concern. Reverend Marsh heard the news during his circuit and immediately made the difficult journey to visit the Thorntons, arriving unannounced on a cold afternoon 2 weeks after the children's departure. The Reverend found Rebecca alone, William having gone to the settlement to purchase supplies with their new financial resources. She received the preacher with a combination of relief and dread, desperate for spiritual counsel but terrified of judgment she already knew she deserved. Marsh listened to her tearful explanation of their situation, of the starvation they faced, of the opportunities the children would supposedly receive, of the temporary nature of the arrangements. He asked careful questions about the contracts, about the households receiving the children, about the nature of the financial transactions involved. His gentle inquiry gradually revealed details Rebecca had not fully acknowledged even to herself, the reality that they had effectively sold their children despite the legal language framing it as service contracts. When Rebecca finished her explanation and justifications, Marsh sat in silence for a long time, struggling between pastoral compassion and moral clarity. Finally, he spoke, acknowledging their desperate circumstances but noting that selling children into servitude, regardless of contractual terminology, represented a profound breach of parental trust and Christian duty. He did not condemn them with harsh rhetoric but rather with sorrowful observation about how fear and desperation could lead faithful people into actions they would spend years regretting. He prayed with Rebecca, asking God for mercy and for the children's protection, though both of them understood that prayers could not undo transactions already concluded and children already scattered. When William returned and found Marsh still there, the conversation took a sharper edge. The Reverend confronted William more directly about the financial aspects, about receiving land and gold in exchange for his children, about the moral distinction between arranging opportunities and accepting payment for surrendering parental rights. William responded defensively, rehearsing his rationalizations about benefits and opportunities, about responsibilities to ensure his children's futures, about the impossibility of their previous situation. Marsh listened patiently, then asked one devastating question. If the arrangements were truly in the children's best interests, why had William accepted money and land rather than simply paying for their placement in beneficial situations? The question hung in the air unanswered because no honest response was possible. William had convinced himself his motivations were primarily parental rather than financial, but the Reverend's inquiry exposed this self-deception. The transaction had been mutual, with William receiving compensation for his children's labor disguised as securing their opportunities. The land deed in his pocket and the remaining gold in his strongbox represented not just the means to future stability but the price paid for his children's freedom. Marsh left without offering absolution or easy comfort, promising continued prayers but clearly disturbed by what he had learned about people he had considered exemplary Christians. The community's subtle ostracism began shortly after Marsh's visit, with neighbors finding reasons to avoid interaction with the Thorntons. Church attendance became awkward, with families maintaining formal politeness while withdrawing previous friendliness. Invitations to social gatherings ceased. Offers of mutual aid during difficult times were not extended. The isolation the Thorntons experienced was not dramatic or openly hostile, but rather a quiet collective judgment expressed through withdrawal of community connection. William and Rebecca found themselves pariahs among people who had previously considered them neighbors and fellow believers, the social cost of their transaction adding to burdens they already carried. March brought genuine spring weather to the mountains, with warming temperatures and emerging vegetation marking the season's turn. William and Rebecca began working their newly owned land, clearing ground for planting and making improvements to the small existing cabin. The physical labor provided distraction from emotional anguish, though each task was haunted by awareness of absent children who should have been helping. They spoke little to each other, communication reduced to practical necessities while deeper feelings remained carefully unaddressed. At night, Rebecca cried quietly while William lay awake wrestling with guilt and justification in endless exhausting cycles. Letters arrived sporadically, brought by travelers or mail riders making irregular rounds through the mountains. The first came from the household where Martha had been placed, a brief note dictated to her new mistress and written in elegant script unlike anything Martha could have produced herself. The content was carefully optimistic, describing her duties, mentioning kind treatment, expressing hope that her family was well. Rebecca read and reread this letter until the paper wore soft, clinging to evidence that her daughter was at least alive and apparently not suffering overt abuse. No letters came from the other placements, leaving William and Rebecca to imagine their other children's circumstances without information to temper their fears. As spring progressed toward summer, the Thorntons established new routines structured around 2 people rather than 6, their labor adequate for their reduced property but their lives emptied of the noise and complication children brought. They ate better, their improved resources allowing food security they had not known in years. They made improvements to their property, building and repairing with materials they could now afford. They attended to practical matters of survival and advancement with mechanical efficiency. But none of these material improvements could fill the void created by their children's absence or relieve the guilt that shadowed every moment of relative comfort they now enjoyed. The photograph remained on the mantel, accumulating dust that Rebecca did not wipe away, as though maintaining its condition would somehow preserve what it represented. She sometimes stood before it late at night, studying those frozen faces, trying to remember exact details of voices and expressions that memory was already beginning to soften and distort. She wondered what her children looked like now, whether experiences were changing them in ways she would not recognize when reunion eventually occurred. She questioned whether the young Ruth would even remember her mother after years of absence, whether the older children would understand and forgive the choices made supposedly for their benefit but that served their parents' survival at their expense. William avoided looking at the photograph, unable to face the accusation he saw in those serious young faces. He threw himself into physical labor, working his land with an intensity that went beyond practical necessity into something approaching penance. He rarely spoke of the children, deflecting Rebecca's attempts to discuss them with comments about the futility of dwelling on circumstances they could not change. He rationalized their decision with renewed determination whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm his defenses, reminding himself of the starvation they had faced, of the opportunities the children would receive, of the proper use of parental authority to make difficult choices for those not yet capable of deciding for themselves. But in quiet moments, usually in darkness when defenses were weakest, William confronted the reality that Reverend Marsh had identified. He had sold his children, regardless of legal terminology or self-serving rationalizations. The land under his feet and the remaining gold in his strongbox were purchased with his children's labor and years of their lives, a transaction that no amount of justification about opportunities and training could fully redeem. He had betrayed the trust implicit in fatherhood, placing his own survival above his children's welfare, choosing property over people despite his professed Christian values. The photograph captured a family that no longer existed, a unity he had personally destroyed for 40 acres and some gold coins. Summer arrived, bringing heat to the mountains and continued isolation from their community. The Thorntons worked their land, maintained their cabin, and existed in the hollow shell of a life purchased through the sale of those who should have been sharing it. The photograph watched from the mantel, silent testimony to what had been lost, a permanent record of the family that posed in faith and unity while their father contemplated the betrayal he would soon execute and their mother prepared to accept the unacceptable for the sake of temporary survival. The years that followed the children's departure moved with the strange duality of time that marks profound loss. Individual days stretched endlessly while seasons blurred together in retrospect. William and Rebecca Thornton settled into the rhythms of childless existence, their materially improved circumstances offering cold comfort for the emptiness that pervaded their daily lives. The cabin that had once been crowded with young voices and constant activity now echoed with oppressive silence broken only by necessary conversations about chores, weather, and the practical minutiae of their reduced household. The land William had acquired proved modestly productive, yielding enough for their needs with surplus occasionally sold at the settlement for additional income. They were no longer hungry, no longer desperate in the immediate material sense that had characterized their previous existence. The old lease obligations and debts were settled, replaced by the independence of clear ownership. By conventional economic measures, the transaction had succeeded in stabilizing their circumstances, providing the security William had claimed to seek when justifying arrangements he could barely acknowledge in darkness when his conscience would not be silenced. But prosperity measured in acres and harvest yields could not fill the absence that haunted every corner of their lives. Rebecca moved through her days with mechanical precision, maintaining household routines stripped of their previous purpose. She cooked for 2 rather than 6, her skills now devoted to meals that often went half-eaten because grief diminished appetite. She mended clothing for absent children, maintaining garments they had outgrown and would never wear again, finding comfort in the familiar motions even as the activity highlighted their absence. She tended a garden that produced more than she needed, as though abundance could somehow compensate for the emptiness that pervaded her existence. Letters from the children arrived irregularly, their frequency and content varying with circumstances at their separate placements. Martha's correspondence continued most reliably, the merchant household apparently honoring their commitment to allow communication. Her letters evolved from the initial carefully optimistic notes dictated to her mistress into gradually more complex messages as she developed literacy skills under her new household's instruction. She described daily routines, mentioned people she encountered, and expressed carefully worded sentiments about missing her family while also acknowledging benefits of her education and training. Between the lines of proper sentiment, Rebecca sensed loneliness and adaptation to circumstances not freely chosen, the gradual transformation of her daughter into someone shaped by experiences the family could not share. Communication from Samuel's placement came less frequently, rough notes obviously written with difficulty by someone whose labor left little energy for correspondence. He mentioned farm work, mechanical training at the mill, and treatment that seemed fair if not particularly warm. His letters conveyed stoic acceptance rather than enthusiasm, a young man enduring circumstances while waiting for contracted obligations to expire. Rebecca treasured these brief messages, reading into terse sentences entire narratives about her son's development from boy to man, changes occurring beyond her observation or influenced Joseph's letters, when they came, showed the intellectual development his placement was supposedly fostering. His schoolteacher guardians were apparently investing genuine effort in his education, his correspondence demonstrating improving vocabulary and increasingly sophisticated expression. He wrote about books he was reading, ideas he was encountering, and observations about the world beyond the mountains. His messages conveyed curiosity and growing knowledge, but also a subtle distance, the intellectual growth creating perspectives that separated him from origins he could not share with people whose education had been so limited. Rebecca felt both pride in his obvious advancement and sorrow that his development was occurring in contexts that made him increasingly foreign to the parents who had surrendered him. The absence of letters from Ruth's placement generated the most profound anxiety and guilt. The childless couple who had taken the youngest Thornton child apparently saw no need to facilitate communication with her birth family, treating Ruth as effectively their own daughter without maintaining connections to her previous life. Rebecca's imagination created endless scenarios about Ruth's circumstances, alternating between hopes that she was being well-treated and raised with genuine affection and fears that she was suffering abuse or neglect beyond Rebecca's ability to discover or prevent. The uncertainty was torment, made worse by consciousness that Ruth's young age meant she was likely forgetting her birth family entirely, memories of mother and siblings fading into vague impressions eventually replaced by new attachments and experiences. William's response to the children's absence differed from Rebecca's in expression though not in fundamental pain. He avoided discussing them, deflecting his wife's attempts at conversation about their welfare or future. He threw himself into continuous labor, always finding new projects requiring attention, clearing additional ground, building unnecessary structures, creating activity that prevented stillness where reflection might occur. He attended church irregularly, uncomfortable with the community's continued cool distance and unable to fully engage with spiritual messages that often seemed directed at his specific failures despite being delivered to the general congregation. Reverend Marsh maintained pastoral contact with the Thorntons despite their estrangement from the broader community. He visited several times yearly, ostensibly for routine ministerial care but clearly motivated by concern for their spiritual and emotional state. These visits were awkward for all parties, with William responding defensively to gentle inquiry and Rebecca breaking down in tearful confession of regrets she could not resolve through prayer or repentance. Marsh offered what comfort he could while also refusing to minimize the gravity of their actions or pretend that good intentions justified selling children into servitude regardless of contractual terminology. During one particularly difficult conversation in the fall of 1874, Marsh asked William directly whether he still believed the arrangements had been in the children's best interests or whether time and experience had modified his perspective. William's response mixed defensive justification with emerging acknowledgement of doubt, admitting that while the children were receiving education and training, the cost of family rupture might ultimately exceed whatever practical benefits the placements provided. The Reverend pressed further, asking whether William would make the same decision if faced again with their 1871 circumstances. Knowing what he now understood about consequences both practical and emotional, William could not answer honestly without admitting he had made a terrible mistake, an acknowledgement that would undermine the rationalizations sustaining his fragile psychological equilibrium. He responded with anger rather than reflection, defending his choices as necessary responses to impossible situations, blaming circumstances rather than accepting personal responsibility for decisions that had been his to make. Marsh absorbed this defensive outburst with patient sorrow, recognizing that William remained unable to fully confront what he had done because the guilt would be psychologically overwhelming if not filtered through extensive justification and blame-shifting. Rebecca's reckoning with their actions progressed differently, moving gradually from justification toward genuine remorse uncomplicated by defensive maneuvering. She acknowledged to Marsh during a private conversation that she had allowed fear and desperation to override maternal instinct, accepting William's reasoning because confronting their situation honestly seemed too difficult. She admitted that her consent had been based more on exhaustion and inability to identify alternatives than actual conviction that selling their children was morally acceptable or genuinely beneficial to those being sold. Her tears during these confessions reflected authentic grief rather than self-pity, sorrow for what she had allowed to happen to vulnerable children who had depended on parental protection she failed to provide. The Reverend's counsel to Rebecca emphasized God's capacity for forgiveness while also acknowledging that some actions create consequences that persist regardless of repentance. He suggested that her remaining years should be devoted to making whatever amends were possible when the children's contracts expired and reunion became possible. He encouraged her to maintain communication with those placements allowing it, to save money that might help the children establish independent lives when they aged out of service, and to prepare emotionally for the reality that reunion would not restore what had been lost but would require building new relationships with people shaped by years of separation and experiences the family had not shared. As 1875 progressed toward 1876, subtle changes in the children's letters suggested their developing maturity and the approaching transitions to adult independence. Samuel, now nearing 20 years old, wrote of plans beyond his current placement, mentioning possibilities for wage labor or perhaps acquiring land to work independently. His messages conveyed no expressed intention to return to the mountains or re-establish close family connections, a distance that reflected years of emotional separation as much as geographic displacement. Rebecca recognized that she would likely lose her oldest son even after his contractual obligations expired, that the family rupture had created psychological barriers that time would not automatically dissolve. Martha's letters began mentioning a young man employed in the merchant household's business operations, casual references that Rebecca correctly interpreted as romantic interest. At 18, Martha was approaching the age when mountain women typically married, and her new life in the Piedmont town offered prospects dramatically different from what she would have encountered in the isolated mountain community of her birth. Rebecca understood with bittersweet clarity that her daughter would likely establish life entirely independent of her birth family, that the opportunities the placement provided would enable Martha to escape mountain poverty but would also ensure permanent separation from origins she had been forced to abandon. Joseph's correspondence demonstrated continuing intellectual development but also growing philosophical distance from perspectives his parents could share. Now 15 years old and deeply engaged with formal education, he wrote about ideas and ambitions that reflected worldviews fundamentally different from the practical survivalism that had characterized his early childhood. He mentioned possibilities of continuing education beyond basic schooling, of potential professional opportunities that would take him even further from the mountains and the life his parents understood. His letters, while affectionate in tone, revealed a young man for whom reunion with his birth family would be primarily obligation rather than genuine desire, the intellectual growth separating him from people whose education and experiences could not meet him in the realms he now inhabited. The continued absence of communication regarding Ruth gnawed at Rebecca's consciousness, the silence about her youngest child creating fears that intensified rather than diminished with passing time. In 1876, nearly 5 years after Ruth's departure, Rebecca convinced William to attempt direct contact with the household that had taken her. They composed a careful letter requesting information about Ruth's welfare and expressing hope that some communication might be established. Weeks became months without response, the silence suggesting that the childless couple had indeed fully claimed Ruth as their own and had no intention of facilitating connections to her previous life. This unanswered inquiry precipitated a crisis in Rebecca's already fragile emotional state. She became obsessed with Ruth's unknown circumstances, her imagination creating increasingly disturbing scenarios about what might be happening to her daughter. She insisted that William make the journey to investigate personally, an expensive and time-consuming undertaking he resisted both for practical reasons and because confronting the full reality of Ruth's separation would require facing guilt. He preferred to keep at manageable distance. Their conflict over this issue represented the most direct confrontation about their decision they had engaged in since the children's departure, with Rebecca explicitly blaming William for choices he had insisted upon and she had too weakly resisted. William finally agreed to attempt locating Ruth during the fall of 1876, motivated partly by Rebecca's deteriorating condition and partly by his own suppressed need to verify that at least his youngest child was safe and adequately cared for. The journey took him through familiar territory toward Asheville, then beyond into regions he had never previously visited, searching for a household based on incomplete address information and description. After days of difficult travel and numerous false leads, he located the property where Ruth had supposedly been placed, a prosperous-looking farm with well-maintained buildings suggesting comfortable circumstances. The couple who answered his knock were middle-aged and initially confused by his appearance, not immediately understanding his connection to the child they now called by a different name. When William explained who he was and why he had come, their demeanor shifted from confusion to defensive hostility. They made clear that Ruth, whom they had renamed Elizabeth, was their daughter in every meaningful sense, that the service contract gave them full custody rights until her 18th birthday, and that William's sudden appearance after 5 years of absence was unwelcome disruption they would not tolerate. They refused to allow him to see her, insisted she was well cared for and happy, and threatened legal action if he attempted any further contact or interference with their family. William returned to the mountains devastated by what he had learned, though he modified details when reporting to Rebecca. He confirmed Ruth was alive and apparently healthy, living in comfortable circumstances with people who could provide material advantages far beyond what the Thorntons could have offered. He described the farm's prosperity and implied the couple's genuine affection for the child they were raising. But he omitted their hostility, their refusal to allow contact, and the clear reality that Ruth had been so completely absorbed into her new family that she effectively no longer existed as his daughter except in biological fact. He could not bear to inflict this complete truth on Rebecca, though his evasions probably caused more harm than honest reporting would have generated. The years 1877 through 1879 brought continued material stability for William and Rebecca, but also progressive emotional deterioration that prosperity could not address. They were now established landowners with productive acreage and modest savings, respectable by conventional mountain standards. But their relationship had been poisoned by guilt, resentment, and accumulated grief that daily proximity only intensified rather than resolved. They coexisted rather than genuinely living together, their marriage reduced to practical partnership emptied of affection or mutual comfort. The photograph remained on the mantel, now visibly aged and faded, a constant reminder of the family they had destroyed through choices no amount of retrospective regret could undo. Martha married in 1879, news delivered in a brief letter announcing the event after it occurred rather than inviting family attendance. She had wed the young man from the merchant household, establishing life in the Piedmont town with no expressed intention of returning to the mountains or maintaining close family connections. Her letter was polite but distant, describing her new circumstances without acknowledging the years of separation or the family rupture that had made her current life possible. Rebecca understood that Martha had chosen to move forward rather than back, creating new family attachments to replace those broken by the transaction that had scattered the Thornton children 5 different directions. That Samuel's contract expired in 1880, his 9 years of service completing on schedule. He did not return to the mountains but instead took wage labor in the same area where he had been placed, using skills developed during his service period to earn independent living. He sent a brief message informing his parents of this decision, explaining that mountain life offered too few opportunities for someone with his training and ambitions. The message was matter-of-fact rather than hostile, but its implications were clear. Samuel had chosen to remain in the world he had been sold into rather than returning to family and region that now seemed limited compared to possibilities available elsewhere. That Joseph's trajectory had become even more distant from his mountain origins, his placement household facilitating continuation of his education beyond basic schooling. By 1880 he was preparing for possible college attendance, an achievement almost unimaginable for someone from his background but made feasible by intellectual abilities his service placement had developed. His letters expressed gratitude for educational opportunities while carefully avoiding direct discussion of the arrangements that had enabled them, acknowledgement that might require examining moral complexities he preferred to leave unexplored. He maintained affectionate regard for his parents but clearly intended to build life far removed from their world, his future shaped more by education than by family connection. Ruth's situation remained unknown despite William's attempted investigation. She had been effectively erased from the Thornton family, absorbed into her new household without maintaining connections to her origins. Rebecca accepted that she would likely never see her youngest child again, that Ruth would live and die as someone else's daughter without memory or knowledge of her birth mother. This particular loss hollowed Rebecca in ways the older children's chosen distance did not, because at least with them she could imagine potential future reconnection, whereas Ruth was simply gone, transformed into Elizabeth and existing in a parallel life the Thorntons could never access. In 1881, Cornelius Blackwood appeared unexpectedly at the Thornton cabin, his first visit since completing the original transaction 10 years prior. His presence brought immediate visceral response from both William and Rebecca, the land agent representing everything about the past they preferred to avoid confronting. Blackwood explained he was conducting follow-up on various contracts his agency had facilitated, gathering information about outcomes that would inform future placements. He asked detailed questions about the children's current circumstances and the Thorntons' assessment of how the arrangements had ultimately served everyone's interests. William's responses were defensive and abbreviated, providing minimal information while avoiding substantive evaluation. Rebecca, however, broke down entirely, confronting Blackwood with unfiltered truth about the devastation his arrangements had created despite whatever practical benefits might have accrued. She described years of guilt and grief, permanent family rupture, children scattered and absorbed into other lives, and the hollow prosperity purchased through betrayal of parental obligations. Her emotional outburst clearly disturbed Blackwood, though he maintained professional composure while retreating from engagement he had not anticipated and clearly wished to avoid. After Blackwood departed, William and Rebecca had their most honest conversation about the children since the original decision to proceed with the contracts. William finally admitted doubt about whether the arrangements had truly been necessary or beneficial, acknowledging that desperation had led him to accept solutions that violated instincts he should have trusted. Rebecca confessed her own culpability in consenting to arrangements she had recognized as wrong, admitting that she had chosen survival over protection of those who depended on her. They wept together, not in reconciliation but in shared acknowledgement of grief that would accompany them through whatever years remained. The 1880s progressed with William and Rebecca aging into isolation, their community connections never fully restored after the stigma of selling their children. They maintained their land with diminishing energy, gradually reducing cultivation as age limited their capacity for heavy labor. They received occasional letters from Martha and Joseph, brief messages acknowledging continued existence without suggesting deep ongoing connection. Samuel had apparently married and was raising his own family in the Piedmont region, news delivered secondhand through travelers rather than direct communication. Ruth remained entirely absent, a ghost haunting Rebecca's consciousness without possibility of resolution. In 1886, 15 years after the photograph that had captured their family in false unity, Reverend Marsh died during a difficult mountain crossing in winter weather. His death removed the last person who had maintained persistent spiritual connection with the Thorntons despite their isolation from broader community life. The funeral brought together mountain families from across the region, people who had known Marsh for decades and valued his dedicated ministry to their scattered settlements. William and Rebecca attended, standing at the periphery among neighbors who acknowledged them with formal politeness but without warmth or welcome. During the service, multiple speakers praised Marsh's commitment to truth-telling even when it was difficult or unwelcome, his refusal to offer comfortable lies when honest counsel required harder messages. These tributes seemed directed at the entire assembly, but Rebecca heard them as specific commentary on her family's situation, reminder that Marsh had identified their decision as wrong despite their desperate circumstances and had maintained that judgment even while offering pastoral care and compassion. His death felt like final abandonment, loss of the one person who had continued engaging with them despite full knowledge of what they had done. The 1890s brought old age with its accumulated physical and emotional deterioration. William's health declined steadily, the hard labor of previous decades taking toll that prosperity could not alleviate. Rebecca cared for him with the same mechanical competence she brought to all tasks, providing necessary attention without the affection that might have made caregiving meaningful rather than merely dutiful. They spoke little, their silence reflecting decades of accumulated guilt and mutual blame that conversation could not resolve and might only intensify. In 1893, William died quietly in his sleep, his last years having been characterized by increasing withdrawal from engagement with life. Rebecca arranged a simple burial on their property, unable to face community church service with people who had never fully forgiven or forgotten what the Thorntons represented. She stood alone at the grave, the only attendees being two neighbors who came from obligation rather than genuine regard. No children appeared to mourn their father, the family rupture complete and permanent. Rebecca read biblical passages over the fresh earth, words about judgment and mercy that provided little comfort given her acute consciousness of failings that would accompany her through whatever time remained. The final years of the century found Rebecca living alone in the cabin, surrounded by land purchased through the sale of her children, sustained by resources acquired through betrayal of the most fundamental parental obligations. She maintained basic existence without purpose or joy, waiting for death with the same passive resignation that had characterized her consent to William's plan 28 years earlier. The photograph still sat on the mantel, now badly faded and damaged by time, showing faces she could barely distinguish but that remained burned into memory regardless of visual clarity. In 1900, as a new century began, Martha made an unexpected visit to the mountains, returning to check on her aging mother after years of absence and minimal communication. Now 40 years old with grown children of her own, Martha arrived as a prosperous woman whose life had been shaped entirely by the trajectory initiated when her parents sold her into service at 12 years old. The reunion was awkward, with mother and daughter struggling to connect across decades of separation and vastly different life experiences. Rebecca saw in Martha's face echoes of the child she remembered but recognized that the intervening years had created someone fundamentally foreign to the isolated mountain woman who had given her birth. Martha's visit was brief, motivated more by duty than genuine desire for reconnection. She provided financial assistance for Rebecca's remaining years, arranged for neighbors to check on her regularly, and promised to stay in occasional contact. But she made clear through both words and demeanor that the mountains represented a past she had escaped rather than home she wished to reclaim, that the transaction facilitating her service placement had ultimately enabled a better life than she would have known if her parents had found some way to keep their family intact through those desperate years. Her perspective offered no comfort to Rebecca, who understood that material success could not justify or redeem the initial betrayal regardless of eventual outcomes. After Martha departed, Rebecca spent her final months reviewing her life with the clarity that approaching death sometimes provides. She understood that their decision in 1871 had been born from genuine desperation, that William had not been entirely wrong about the impossibility of their situation, and that the children had indeed received opportunities they could not have accessed in the mountains. But she also recognized with absolute certainty that selling them into servitude, regardless of legal terminology or subsequent outcomes, had violated something fundamental about human relationship and parental obligation. The children had survived and in some cases even prospered, but the family had been destroyed, connections severed in ways that decades could not heal. Rebecca died in 1902, alone in the cabin except for the faded photograph that had survived years after the family it depicted had been scattered to permanent dissolution. She left the land to Martha, the only child with whom she had maintained any contact, though she knew her daughter would likely sell rather than return to claim property purchased through the transaction that had enabled her escape from mountain poverty. The other children were mentioned in a final letter Rebecca left, expressing love and regret in equal measure, acknowledging that good intentions and desperate circumstances could not excuse choices whose consequences had extended across decades and shaped lives in ways no amount of belated remorse could undo. The photograph eventually came into Martha's possession along with other family items of minimal value. She kept it briefly before discarding it during a household reorganization, the image seeming more accusation than treasure, reminder of family origins she preferred to leave unexamined. It ended up in a pile of refuse, that carefully posed portrait of the Thornton family in 1871, William holding his Bible with stern authority, Rebecca standing with quiet strength, for children arranged in descending order with serious expressions suggesting dignity and proper upbringing. The image that was supposed to celebrate family unity instead documented the last moment before betrayal began its work of destruction, a frozen instant of false virtue moments before desperation drove parents to sell their children into servitude in exchange for land they could call their own. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.